First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and to learn about all the excellent work that you're doing with ESA and on port cities. So I would like to take the opportunity to talk a bit and to continue on what Victoria was already introducing, to talk a bit about our work around port cities. So with the Port City Futures initiative from the three universities, Leiden, Delft, and Erasmus, we're trying to investigate the socio-spatial conditions of the use and design of port city regions. And the idea is that we need to recreate a port city culture, something that brings the people, that recreates an awareness among people of how water and land are interconnected and the role particularly of port city regions therein. Because I would argue that port cities have been at the forefront of industrialization and thus also of energy, all the energy challenges that we face today. And ideally, they are also at the forefront of solving these challenges. So I would like to make 3 points and show you quite a bit of images in the hope that this will be a foundation for future collaboration around the work with the Union for the Mediterranean and around port cities. So I would like to make 3 points. One about viscous spaces, so this whole shift between water and land spaces. One about deep mapping and going also back into the past to connect to the contemporary data that you are producing. And then the question of exploring what I call port city dualities, the relation between port and cities, and to see what kind of data we could be using there. So we work with this idea of port city Scape, which is looking at port cities not just as bounded entities, but really from the sea, the drilling platforms, the pipelines, all the way into the hinterland with the various logistics centers. And so understanding the port, not just in its specific boundaries, but having a much larger impact on both sea and land. And I think from our perspective, looking at space, we are trying to say we need to go beyond a national focus that is bounded by national boundaries to one that looks at port cities from the sea towards the hinterland. And that makes it much easier to compare cities like Hamburg, Rotterdam, London, or to compare cities around the Mediterranean, because they're all facing the same transport streams, the same goods, the same type of container ships. And so we've just published a book which might be of interest, is The Urbanization of the Sea, looking particularly at the urbanization of the North Sea and trying to map it. Now, you're all familiar with viscous spaces in terms of sea level rise, expected sea level rise, but this has quite some impact also on the land side. And to just show you one example, as sea level rise occurs, this is a view of Philadelphia, a very old refinery here. We have seen also after Hurricane Harvey how these refineries get flooded, how the dirty water spreads into neighborhood, pollutes neighborhoods, and even water that is wiped out of the ground and pollution that's wiped out of the ground, flooding entire areas. So those are the spaces that I would then call viscous spaces, and they have a lot of impact on how we live. Now, what I mean with deep mapping and what we've been working on is to try and identify historical long-term processes and how they shape port city regions. So far, we've mostly worked on the North Sea through identifying historical maps and mapping them both in terms of scale and in time. One of the ways that we are trying to do it or working with our computer science colleagues is to see if we can automatically read historical maps so that we can extract the way that water and land have shifted, their relation has shifted over time, but also mapping that in the context of institutional boundaries, and then identifying path dependencies. So comparing a Rotterdam with a Hamburg or a London, you might say that in Rotterdam, the port leads, the city has always tried to catch up. In the case of Hamburg, and again, these are very small, but if you look at the institutional boundaries, so in the case of London, the port has always escaped in some ways from the city beyond the institutional boundaries, whereas in the case of Hamburg, port and city have formed a tandem. Each of these approaches will lead to different energy strategies and also energy transition strategies, I would argue, because in the end, we need to deal with the various stakeholders, with the implication of citizens in these transformations. So in terms of energy mapping, we've looked more closely at the region of Rotterdam, The Hague. And what you see there, and just to illustrate the point that I was making before, you have specific path dependencies. So this is 1910. The dirty oil is largely in the port of Rotterdam, whereas the institutional headquarters, the decision makers, are already located in the capital of The Hague. And so wealth tends to accumulate in The Hague, so evidenced here through the presence of gas stations. So there were more people in 1940 owning cars, apparently, in The Hague rather than in Rotterdam. And so you can see the way that oil spreads through the built environment through the spread of gas stations. This is what we've been mapping here, trying to use as much historical data as possible. And you can see that by 1970, which is the date we see here, oil was still largely in the cities and very little was in the landscape. And it's only with regional plans for the construction of highways that by 2000, the landscape is also becoming occupied by gas stations. And at the same time, we see this huge petrochemical complex rise in the port of Rotterdam, which is currently occupied 3/4 by petroleum. So this kind of mapping using data of the past, I hope would be really, might enrich, can help, and we would definitely benefit from taking this data further into the future and exploring the relationships between city and region, city and port, land and water, combining both spatial data with institutional data and using it also to identify, for example, social justice patterns. And we've now continued to use this energy mapping to also look at the green energy transition. And often you find that the same kind of spaces that have been occupied by oil first are also the ones that are leading the green energy transition. And you might see that the number of electric loading stations for cars may be denser in the same areas where we earlier saw the same petroleum stations arise, gas stations arise. So what we are trying to do with this mapping is use the spatial dimensions to combine them with more social ones and cultural ones, with the idea to actually get to a stakeholder debate, conversations, to make people aware of challenges between sea and land, between port and city, and ideally to come to a conversation about it. So briefly diving into the idea of dualities, if you look at the port, you have challenges between industry and living. That's a health challenge, among others, and Tanaya will talk more about that. We have challenges of migration. We have challenges of logistics running through neighborhoods where kids play. And these challenges play out on sea, drilling platforms, on the coast. They also play out in port city extensions. And I think all of these challenges that I'm showing here are challenges or dualities where ESA's data can be is hugely important. So when you discuss a port city extension like the one in Skikda, a lot of discussion comes up around sustainable development and the point which way is the best way to do it, how do we evaluate sustainability, and so on and so forth. Once it's getting built, it is built, data is hugely important. Data is important in the energy transition, building on the kind of deep mapping that I showed you before, but also even offshore floating wind parks will change sea spaces as much as they change land spaces. And I think it's very important to not think of the sea just as a blank area where we can dump almost anything possible, but to think very carefully also in planning terms, what belongs to the sea, how is the sea reshaped if we build into it. But I do think that your data on the sea also connects to data on land. For example, infrastructure that leads from the port to the hinterland, here in the case of Naples. Movements on even safety discussions like here with the Vesuvio in Italy in the background. And we can hopefully relate this to waterfront redevelopments. I'm sure even if we think about sea level rise, that data can be highly important there. I do want to mention the importance of the data for application also in terms of heritage and preservation or even culture. When we look at this map from UNESCO on World Heritage Sites, we see how many of these sites are on coasts and are port cities, and a lot of them are actually in danger. So places like Byblos will be hugely affected by climate change, by sea level rise, and getting data even on the transformation of heritage structures will be hugely important. This type of heritage also plays a huge role in cruise shipping, in the amount of tourists, in the amount of big ships going into small cities like Venice and effectively flooding those cities. Sea level rise data is also river change data. So questions about how the height between water and river and bridges changes, or what the depth is of ships that can actually cross the river, or what the risks of flooding are all water data. And to give you one more example, and there's certainly many more, even questions of subsidence, of the sinkage of land, I think are even landside data that can probably be tracked through what you do. So to conclude, with our Port City Futures group, we've been arguing that port cities are a particular type of city, have made a small film on the magic of port cities. If you're interested, check it out. And we're also launching now a massive online open course trying to get this relationship between space, society, and culture in the open around port cities. So to recreate an awareness among water professionals, port professionals, city professionals, but also master level students. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure. And later on, I'm happy to share or answer any questions.